Walt Disney built an empire out of imagination, a kingdom of color, sound, and wonder that reshaped global culture. His name became synonymous with magic. But behind the myth of the man who transformed storytelling stood a family that grew in the long shadow cast by his achievements. While the world adored the characters he created, far fewer ever looked closely at the children and grandchildren who inherited not castles or crowns, but the enormous weight of a legacy that reached into every home on Earth. Today, the Disney Empire is a multinational titan, yet the story of the 10 grandchildren born into its orbit is far more complicated, shaped by wealth, conflict, philanthropy, estrangement, and the responsibility of carrying a name that billions recognize. Their lives reveal how the heirs of an entertainment revolutionary navigated the benefits and burdens of the world he built. This is the untold saga of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, a dynasty raised in the glow of magic, but tested by the realities behind it. The Disney legacy is often described in terms of fantasy, innovation, and global influence. Yet the reality of Walt Disney's family life was far more private, restrained, and complex than the empire he left behind. Walt had 2 daughters, Diane and Sharon, and through them came 10 grandchildren who inherited not only his name, but the consequences of his fame, fortune, and the colossal machine built from his imagination. These grandchildren were raised not in the glittering dreamscape of Disneyland, but in homes shaped by strict privacy, financial responsibility, and the unspoken pressure of being the direct descendants of a cultural architect whose work transcended generations. Their lives unfolded in very different directions. Some became philanthropists, devoting their resources to education, environmental protection, and social causes. Others entered creative fields, attempting to understand or reinterpret the imagination that had defined their grandfather's life. A few stepped into the corporate arena, influencing the future of the Walt Disney Company during moments of internal upheaval and transformation. And at least one grandchild emerged as an outspoken critic of the fortune she inherited, exposing family conflicts that challenged the myth of harmony surrounding the Disney name. Together, they represent a mosaic of paths shaped by privilege, responsibility, rebellion, and reinvention. Understanding the Disney grandchildren means looking beyond the fantasy worlds their grandfather created and into the human stories that followed. Their experiences reveal how a family can remain both connected to and overwhelmed by an empire that grew far beyond the intentions of its founder. And it is through their individual journeys that we begin to understand the complicated inheritance of the world's most famous storyteller. Walt Disney's family story began far from the bright lights and global adoration that would one day define his name. His private world was shaped by discipline, ambition, and a relentless work ethic that often left little room for sentimentality. Though he created the most recognizable characters on Earth, Walt himself guarded his family's privacy fiercely. His 2 daughters, Diane, his biological child, and Sharon, adopted shortly after birth, were raised in a home where imagination was encouraged, but exposure to publicity was not. Walt believed firmly that the Disney name should belong to his work, not to a celebrity lifestyle that he wanted no part of. As a result, the next generation grew up largely protected from the world's fascination with their father. Diane Disney Miller, the elder daughter, grew into a steady and grounded presence, marrying Ron Miller, a college football star who later became president and CEO of the Walt Disney Company. Their marriage produced 7 children and created a branch of the family rooted in a blend of tradition, philanthropy, and corporate responsibility. Diane championed the preservation of her father's legacy, ultimately establishing the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, a project meant to humanize a man often seen only through the lens of myth. Her children were raised with a sense of history, duty, and the quiet understanding that their grandfather's empire carried both opportunity and immense pressure. Sharon Mae Disney, the younger daughter, lived a more turbulent life shaped by emotional struggle, illness, and financial complexity. She married twice, first to Robert Brown and later to William Lund. Sharon's 3 children came of age in a household marked by privilege, but also by instability. Her early death in 1993 left behind unresolved tensions, contested estates, and family divisions that would later erupt into public legal battles. Among her children was a granddaughter who would become the most vocal critic of the Disney family's wealth, a dramatic contrast to the protective silence Walt had once insisted upon. The 10 Disney grandchildren, split between Diane's 7 and Sharon's 3, inherited a legacy unlike any other in American cultural history. They were born into immense wealth and unimaginable public influence, yet raised under strict expectations to live private, grounded lives. As they grew older, some embraced philanthropy, others moved into creative fields, and a few stepped into leadership positions within the Disney organization during critical turning points. Their stories reveal the complicated reality of being heirs to a man whose work shaped the fantasies of billions, while their own lives unfolded far from the storyboard sketches and animated worlds that built the empire. From this foundation of privacy, wealth, and familial tension, we now turn to the first of Walt Disney's grandchildren. The beginning of a generation raised in the long shadow of a global icon. From the contrasting lives of Diane and Sharon emerged 2 branches of the Disney legacy, each carrying forward different reflections of the man who built an empire. Their children were raised in separate environments, shaped by different expectations, values, and family dynamics. Yet all 10 grandchildren inherited the same unmistakable weight: the Disney name. Some grew up in stable homes marked by discipline and philanthropy. Others were surrounded by turbulence, legal disputes, and the emotional fallout of wealth that arrived faster than guidance could manage. Several stepped into the entertainment world, others retreated from it entirely, and at least one turned her gaze inward, using her platform to confront the privilege and moral burden of the family fortune. What unites these 10 lives is not a shared career path or personality, but the unseen thread of a legacy that hovered over every decision they made. Their stories reveal a generation navigating opportunity and identity in ways Walt Disney himself could never have imagined. And so we begin with the eldest of Diane Disney Miller's children, the first grandchild born into the dynasty of imagination, Christopher Disney Miller. Number 10. Christopher Disney Miller. Christopher Disney Miller, born in 1954 to Diane Disney Miller and Ron Miller, entered the world as the first grandchild of Walt Disney, the earliest torchbearer of a legacy that combined creativity, corporate power, and global cultural influence. Unlike the millions who grew up enchanted by the fantasy worlds his grandfather created, Christopher grew up in the quiet reality behind them. His childhood unfolded not in the spotlight of Disneyland, but in a family determined to protect its privacy and maintain a sense of normalcy, despite the extraordinary empire surrounding them. Diane and Ron raised their children far from Hollywood excess, grounding them in discipline, humility, and a reverence for history that would later shape Christopher's adult identity. As a boy, Christopher lived at the intersection of 2 powerful legacies: the visionary imagination of Walt Disney and the athletic, disciplined steadiness of Ron Miller, a former NFL player turned film producer and ultimately CEO of the Walt Disney Company. Yet Christopher did not inherit his father's competitive drive, nor his grandfather's creative obsession. Instead, he developed a reflective temperament, a quiet curiosity for the world, and a deep affection for the California landscapes that surrounded him. He grew into a young man who admired the creative world from a respectful distance, never feeling compelled to step onto the corporate stage or shape the direction of the Disney empire. His life would be one of private pursuits, not public leadership. Christopher embraced a path of craftsmanship and hands-on work, eventually founding a successful construction business in Northern California. This profession suited his personality: physical, practical, grounded in tangible results rather than corporate pressures or the chaos of public expectation. While other members of the Disney family became philanthropists, executives, or outspoken public figures, Christopher chose a life of measured simplicity. He avoided interviews, public appearances, and the financial drama that often accompanied his extended family. In many ways, he exemplified Walt Disney's original hope for his descendants, that they would live as individuals, not as symbols of an empire. Despite his distance from the entertainment world, Christopher maintained a deep connection to his family, particularly to his mother, Diane, whose efforts to preserve her father's legacy influenced every branch of the family. He supported her vision for the Walt Disney Family Museum and frequently participated in private family gatherings that honored the historical and emotional narratives often overshadowed by the corporation's expansion. Yet, he never sought to influence the direction of the museum or the company. His contribution was presence, stability, and loyalty, qualities that sometimes go unnoticed in dynastic families, but are essential to their cohesion. In the broader story of Walt Disney's grandchildren, Christopher stands as a reminder that legacy is not always lived through public achievement. Sometimes it is carried quietly, through work that builds rather than dazzles, and through a refusal to be defined by wealth or expectation. His life diverges from the dramatic arcs of some of his cousins and siblings, offering instead a portrait of a man who found contentment in the ordinary, even while belonging to one of the most extraordinary families in American history. Number 9. Joanne Miller. Joanne Miller, born in 1956 to Diane Disney Miller and Ron Miller, grew up as the second grandchild of Walt Disney and inherited a childhood shaped by the same paradox that defined her siblings. The world knew her family's name, yet her parents worked tirelessly to ensure their children lived lives grounded in privacy, discipline, and emotional normalcy. While the Disney empire expanded into a global phenomenon, Joanne spent her early years in a family that preferred quiet dinners to red carpets, classical music to corporate meetings, and the natural beauty of Northern California to the glamour of Hollywood. This separation between public myth and private reality became a defining thread in her life. Joanne developed a deep appreciation for the arts at a young age, nurtured by her mother's meticulous preservation of Walt Disney's personal history and by the creative energy that naturally flowed through the Disney Miller household. But unlike her grandfather, whose imagination manifested in animation and world-building, Joanne's creativity expressed itself through movement and performance. She fell in love with ballet, a discipline that blends beauty with relentless practice, and committed herself to it with the quiet intensity that would characterize her adult life. As she matured, Joanne pursued dance not as a fleeting childhood hobby, but as a lifelong passion. She trained with rigor, studied the craft in depth, and eventually became a respected ballet instructor. Her teaching career spanned decades, touching the lives of countless students who encountered her not as the granddaughter of Walt Disney, but as a dedicated mentor who brought precision, grace, and encouragement to every class. In an era when members of prominent families often sought the spotlight or corporate influence, Joanne chose a path rooted in artistic devotion and the transformative power of education. Her life remained closely connected to her family, particularly to her mother Diane, whose efforts to preserve Walt Disney's authentic legacy resonated deeply with Joanne's own values. She supported the creation of the Walt Disney Family Museum, recognizing its mission to humanize her grandfather and correct the misconceptions surrounding him. Yet Joanne never stepped into a public leadership role within the museum or the company. She preferred the quiet influence she exerted in rehearsal studios and classrooms, shaping the discipline and confidence of young dancers rather than the direction of a global corporation. Joanne's personal life reflected the same steadiness she brought to her work. She married, raised a family, and continued to teach even as the Disney legacy expanded into new technological and creative frontiers. While her surname carried the weight of international recognition, she built a life defined by intention rather than inheritance, artistry rather than ambition. Her story represents one of the quieter currents within the Disney dynasty, a life shaped not by boardrooms or billions, but by music, movement, and the small triumphs her students carried into their own futures. In the tapestry of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, Joanne stands as the embodiment of the family's private, artistic heart. Her journey reveals how legacy can be honored not through fame or corporate power, but through dedication to a craft that requires discipline, passion, and humility. Qualities that echo the earliest foundations of her grandfather's creative spirit. Number 8. Tamara Diane Miller. Tamara Diane Miller, born in 1957, entered the world as the third grandchild of Walt Disney. A member of the first generation raised entirely after the myth of her grandfather had begun solidifying into cultural legend. Unlike the millions who knew Walt Disney only through a glowing television screen or the gates of Disneyland, Tamara knew him simply as Grandpa Walt, a gentle but often distant figure whose creativity loomed over the entire family. Yet the life she built for herself would diverge sharply from the dazzling legacy surrounding her name, revealing a path defined not by fantasy, but by deeply personal choices and quiet resilience. Tamara was raised in the same grounded environment her parents insisted upon for all their children. Diane and Ron Miller refused to allow the Disney empire to consume their home, shielding their children from the public fascination that surrounded their last name. As a result, Tamara grew into a young woman who understood the significance of her family heritage, but never allowed it to dictate her identity. She gravitated toward academic and spiritual pursuits, showing a contemplative nature that contrasted with the broader expectations placed upon the descendants of powerful entertainment families. As she matured, Tamara embraced a life rooted in introspection and personal growth rather than outward ambition. While some of her siblings leaned into artistic careers or found themselves drawn into the corporate or philanthropic dimensions of the Disney legacy, Tamara charted a quieter course. She became active in spiritual communities in Northern California and later Hawaii, seeking meaning beyond wealth, recognition, or the cultural machinery built on her grandfather's imagination. Her journey reflected a desire to step away from the expectations of dynasty and instead cultivate a life defined by personal purpose. Tamara's adult years unfolded across the Pacific, where she immersed herself in service-oriented work and holistic learning. Her life in Hawaii, far removed from the corporate pressures of Burbank and the curated narratives of the Disney Museum world, allowed her to build an existence rooted in authenticity and emotional clarity. She became known for her kindness, her introspective depth, and her ability to create connection far from the noise of her family's fame. Yet Tamara's story also includes moments of struggle, not the public feuds or legal battles that would later plague other branches of the Disney family, but the internal conflicts familiar to anyone navigating a powerful inheritance while trying to remain true to themselves. She carried her family's history with quiet strength, choosing not to define herself by the legacy that surrounded her from birth, but neither rejecting it. Instead, she carved out a personal philosophy that allowed her to remain connected to her roots while building a path entirely her own. Tamara passed away in 2019, leaving behind a life remembered not for headlines or corporate impact, but for its gentleness, sincerity, and spiritual depth. In a family where influence often manifested through business, philanthropy, or public storytelling, Tamara's legacy stands as a powerful reminder that the descendants of icons are individuals first, people who must navigate identity, purpose, and personal evolution just like anyone else. In the vast narrative of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, Tamara Diane Miller represents the soul of the family, the grandchild who sought meaning beyond magic, and who chose a life illuminated not by her grandfather's spotlight, but by her own quiet, centered light. Number 7. Jennifer Miller. Jennifer Miller, born in 1960, arrived into a family already split between two worlds: the vast, global empire shaped by her grandfather's imagination, and the quiet, disciplined household her parents fought to preserve in Northern California. From the earliest years of her childhood, Jennifer moved through life with an awareness that the outside world saw the name Disney as a symbol of fantasy and joy, while inside her home, it was treated as something to be protected, respected, and never exploited. She grew up in the delicate balance between myth and reality, a balance that would shape her identity in complex and lasting ways. Unlike some of her siblings who gravitated toward creative or artistic pursuits, Jennifer possessed a temperament defined by empathy, steadiness, and a deep sense of responsibility. She was introverted, thoughtful, and emotionally perceptive, qualities that made her especially close to her mother, Diane Disney Miller, whose commitments extended from preserving the truth of her father's legacy to cultivating a nurturing environment for her children. Jennifer grew up surrounded by conversations about heritage, art, philanthropy, and the dangers of allowing wealth to distort one's character. These early lessons left a lasting impression on her, grounding her in principles that would guide her throughout her life. As Jennifer entered adulthood, she remained deliberately outside the orbit of corporate power or Hollywood expectation. She did not seek leadership at the Disney Company, nor did she pursue public artistic ventures. Instead, she built her career and personal life around service and community, fields that allowed her to express compassion, stability, and emotional clarity. She devoted herself to helping others, becoming the kind of presence whose impact was felt deeply in private, even if it never appeared in headlines. Friends and family remember her as someone who approached every relationship with sincerity, generosity, and a profound sense of ethical purpose. Jennifer also played an important role in the family dynamic, particularly as her siblings pursued increasingly diverse paths. She acted as a grounding force, a quiet mediator, and a consistent emotional anchor during times of loss, transition, or tension. When the family faced public scrutiny or internal disagreement, especially after Walt's passing and later during corporate upheavals, Jennifer maintained a perspective that blended loyalty with a steady desire for integrity and unity. Her presence helped soften the edges of a family burdened by external expectations and internal complexity. Her close bond with her mother evolved into a shared commitment to preserving the authentic history of Walt Disney's life. While she did not step into a formal leadership role in the Walt Disney Family Museum, Jennifer supported its mission and contributed privately to its development. She valued its dedication to truth and nuance, a counterbalance to the mythologized version of Walt Disney that the world so often embraced. Through this support, she honored the legacy of both her grandfather and her mother, not through public speeches, but through fidelity to the family's core values. Jennifer's life reflects a quieter dimension of the Disney dynasty, a reminder that even within a family synonymous with spectacle and entertainment, the truest legacies are often preserved through compassion, humility, and personal integrity. She represents the lineage not of Walt Disney, the global icon, but of Walt Disney, the father, a man whose deepest wish was that his descendants would live grounded, genuine lives far removed from the distortions of fame. In the unfolding tapestry of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, Jennifer Miller stands as the steady thread, subtle yet essential, shaping the family's heart more than its headlines. Number 6. Walter Elias Miller. Walter Elias Miller, born in 1961 and named directly after his legendary grandfather, carried the heaviest symbolic weight of any of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren. From the moment of his birth, he embodied a living reminder of a man whose imagination reshaped global culture. Yet Walter's story defies expectation. Rather than growing into a public face of the Disney legacy or stepping into the corporate machinery that bore his family name, he followed a path marked by introspection, profound struggle, and a life that remained largely hidden from public view. Growing up, Walter experienced what many of his siblings did: a childhood designed by Diane and Ron Miller to be as normal as possible despite the extraordinary expectations surrounding them. But unlike some of his brothers and sisters who responded to this environment with creativity, athleticism, or quiet academic focus, Walter carried an emotional sensitivity that set him apart. He grew up acutely aware of the gap between who his grandfather was to the world and the much simpler story his mother told him at home. This duality, public myth versus private memory, became a tension that never fully left him. From adolescence onward, Walter struggled with direction, identity, and emotional clarity. While his siblings built grounded lives through discipline, artistry, or service, Walter wrestled with internal battles that few outside the family understood. His life became defined not by outward ambition, but by a deep, ongoing search for stability in a world where the Disney name could feel like both a burden and a refuge. He attempted various paths, exploring different studies and occupations, but never found a singular vocation that anchored him the way the arts grounded Joanne or business grounded Christopher. His journey was one of trial, error, and persistent effort, marked by a quiet determination that the world never saw. As the family expanded its philanthropic endeavors, especially through Diane's creation of the Walt Disney Family Museum, Walter maintained a respectful distance. He supported the spirit of the work, but remained cautious about stepping into any role that would draw public attention. For Walter, privacy was not a preference. It was a form of self-preservation. His siblings described him as warm, intelligent, and deeply introspective. Someone who felt things intensely but rarely revealed the full depth of his internal world. Walter's life reached a tragic and heartbreaking turning point in 2000. When he died at the age of 38, his passing shocked his family and devastated his mother, Diane, who later channeled part of her grief into the museum project, determined to honor the legacy of both her son and her father through a narrative rooted in truth, not myth. Walter's death became one of the most painful chapters in the Disney family's private history, a reminder that even in a dynasty associated with joy and imagination, profound loss can strike in ways that reshape a family for generations. Though his life was shorter and more fragile than those of many of his siblings, Walter Elias Miller left an impact that reverberated deeply within the family. He represented the quiet, human side of the Disney legacy, the part that exists behind the films, the theme parks, and the billion-dollar corporation. His story reminds us that legacies built on wonder and fantasy are still carried by real people, whose struggles and vulnerabilities often remain unseen. In the broader narrative of Walt Disney's grandchildren, Walter's chapter stands as the emotional core. A story about the weight of a name, the complexity of inheritance, and the delicate humanity that exists behind even the most magical of empires. Number 5. Ronald Miller Jr. Ronald Miller Jr., born in 1963 as the sixth child of Diane Disney Miller and Ron Miller, grew up in a world uniquely shaped by discipline, athleticism, and the quiet hum of an empire, built long before he was born. Though he carried the Disney name through his mother, Ronald's earliest influences came primarily from his father, a former NFL player whose leadership and work ethic helped steer the Walt Disney Company through one of its most transformational eras. Unlike his siblings who gravitated toward the arts or community work, Ronald's disposition aligned with structure, performance, and physical rigor. He inherited his father's steadiness and his mother's moral clarity, forging a path grounded in effort rather than expectation. During his childhood, Ronald moved through the same intentionally modest upbringing crafted by Diane and Ron. There were no lavish premieres, no corporate grooming sessions, no spotlight designed to mold him into an heir to the Disney empire. The Miller household valued privacy, work, humility, and personal responsibility. These principles shaped Ronald's early years and helped define his quiet resilience as he matured. He learned early that carrying the name Disney was not a license to privilege, but a responsibility to behave with discipline and integrity, values central to both Diane and her father, Walt. As he grew older, Ronald channeled this structure into athletics. Where some of his siblings found expression in dance studios or music halls, he found his footing on playing fields, where focus and repetition created results untethered from family legacy. Sports offered him a world where effort mattered more than name, a rare escape from the cultural force of the Disney identity. But even in athletics, Ronald remained private, preferring steady progress over public achievement. Adulthood led Ronald toward a career that reflected the same values: consistency, teamwork, and personal accountability. He pursued work outside the entertainment industry, dedicating himself to professions that allowed him to define success on his own terms rather than through inherited expectation. unlike some of his cousins in Sharon's branch of the family, who would later find themselves embroiled in public disputes over inheritance and family governance. Ronald remained firmly grounded, avoiding controversy and living a life guided by quiet purpose. His trajectory stood as a testament to the stability cultivated by Diane and Ron, who raised their children to be self-reliant rather than dependent on the Disney name. Ronald also maintained a strong bond with his siblings, serving as a dependable presence during times of family loss, including the deaths of his younger brother Walter and later his mother Diane. Within the Disney Miller family, Ronald was known not for artistic brilliance or corporate influence, but for his unwavering reliability. He represented the practical heart of the Miller children, modest, thoughtful, and committed to personal integrity above all else. While he did not take on roles in the Walt Disney Company or the Walt Disney Family Museum, Ronald supported the broader mission of honoring his grandfather's legacy through authenticity and ethical stewardship. His life reaffirmed a central truth of the Disney family, that not all heirs choose the path of visibility, and that strength within a dynasty often comes from those who work quietly, steadily, and without expectation of recognition. Ronald Miller Jr.'s story adds a vital dimension to the portrait of Walt Disney's grandchildren. He symbolizes the grounded lineage of the Miller branch, a reminder that behind every towering empire stand descendants who seek, above all else, to live lives defined not by magic, but by meaning. Number 4. Patrick Miller. Patrick Miller, born in 1967, is the seventh and youngest child of Diane Disney. Miller and Ron Miller represents the final chapter of the Disney Miller branch. The last grandchild of Walt Disney, born directly into the household, shaped by both quiet privilege and disciplined restraint. While his siblings each reflected elements of the Disney legacy through creativity, resilience, or introspection, Patrick's story embodies the perspective of a youngest child growing up in a family marked by tradition, expectation, and the ever-present echo of a grandfather the world revered. Patrick arrived when the Miller household was already firmly rooted in Northern California, far from the Hollywood studios and corporate boardrooms that defined so much of Walt Disney's public life. His childhood followed the same philosophies that shaped his siblings: privacy above publicity, responsibility above entitlement, and personal achievement above inherited fame. Diane and Ron raised their children with unwavering intention, believing fiercely that the Disney name should be a moral compass, not a shortcut to influence. As the youngest, Patrick absorbed these values not just through instruction, but through years of observing his older siblings navigate adulthood with discipline and humility. Growing up in such an environment, Patrick developed a grounded, analytical temperament. He showed an affinity for structure, problem-solving, and practical careers, gravitating not toward the arts or public representation of the Disney legacy, but toward fields that rewarded clarity and precision. He pursued academic and professional paths that allowed him to define success independently of his last name. While the world around him continued to mythologize Walt Disney, Patrick cultivated a personality rooted in understated intelligence and quiet confidence. As Patrick entered adulthood, he continued the Miller tradition of building a life outside the gravitational pull of the Walt Disney Company. He chose careers built on personal merit rather than corporate legacy, working in fields where his analytical strengths could flourish. His work, unpublicized and intentionally private, reflected the same steady practicality seen in his brother Ronald, emphasizing contribution over recognition. Patrick did not seek to shape the Disney empire, nor did he position himself as a steward of its future. Instead, he honored his family's values by living with integrity, modesty, and a commitment to meaningful, self-defined work. Within the family, Patrick became known for his reliability and thoughtful presence. He played a quiet but essential role during periods of emotional hardship, including the tragic loss of his brother Walter and the later passing of his mother, Diane. Patrick absorbed the lessons of his parents and grandparents, not through public action, but through steadfast character. He supported his siblings, upheld the emotional fabric of the family, and maintained a strong connection to the broader mission of preserving Walt Disney's authentic legacy. even as he remained personally behind the scenes. Unlike some descendants of prominent families who become entangled in disputes over inheritance or corporate identity, Patrick remained entirely removed from the controversies that later emerged within the Disney Lund branch. He embodied the stability and moral clarity his mother spent her life cultivating, representing the branch of the family most committed to privacy, unity, and quiet responsibility. In the tapestry of Walt Disney's grandchildren, Patrick Miller's story serves as the steady, closing note of the Miller lineage. A reminder that the legacy of a visionary is not carried only by those who seek the spotlight, but also by those who live with grounded purpose, honoring the values of their lineage in their own quiet and deeply human way. Number 3. Victoria Brown. Victoria Brown, born in 1950 to Walt Disney's adopted daughter Sharon Mae Disney and her first husband Robert Brown, entered the world as the eldest grandchild of the Disney Lund branch. A lineage shaped not by steady preservation like Diane's family, but by turbulence, emotional complexity, and the quiet undercurrents of wealth that would ultimately reshape the destiny of every child in that household. Victoria grew up in Los Angeles during the golden age of the Disney Empire. Yet her childhood unfolded not in glittering studios or castle-shaped fantasies, but in a home where privilege coexisted with fragility. Sharon, her mother, loved deeply but wrestled with her own insecurities and health struggles. And the family experienced periods of both stability and disruption. Victoria inherited her mother's sensitivity, but also a fierce independence that would later propel her far beyond the insulated world of Hollywood wealth. While her grandfather's creative empire was expanding into theme parks, television, and global merchandising, Victoria's early life remained tethered to private challenges, including her parents' divorce and the emotional weight that accompanied it. As she matured, Victoria consciously stepped away from the orbit of the Disney identity, seeking meaning in experiences that had nothing to do with animation, fame, or the billion-dollar corporation that bore her name. She grew into a free-spirited young woman who embraced countercultural movements, traveling widely and immersing herself in philosophies far removed from the structured world her grandfather built. Where Diane's children found grounding in tradition and discipline, Victoria sought transformation, self-expression, and a life unconstrained by legacy. Her adult years unfolded across multiple landscapes, from spiritual communities to artistic circles, reflecting a continual search for personal truth. Though she remained connected to her siblings, she distanced herself from the legal and financial complexities that would later engulf the Disney Lund inheritance. Unlike her sister, who would eventually become one of the most outspoken critics of inherited wealth, Victoria's rebellion was quieter, rooted in a desire to chart a life outside the gravitational pull of the Disney empire. Despite this independence, Victoria maintained a protective loyalty toward her family, especially her mother Sharon, whose health declined throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Sharon's death in 1993 marked a turning point for the entire family, a moment when long-standing tensions, estate disputes, and questions of guardianship erupted into public view. Victoria navigated these challenges with grace, choosing not to become a figure in the high-profile legal battles that followed. Her path remained inward-focused, defined by the search for meaning rather than a fight for influence. In the broader narrative of Walt Disney's grandchildren, Victoria represents the first of the Lund branch to diverge from the disciplined, philanthropic model embodied by the Miller family. Her life stands as a portrait of quiet rebellion, a woman who walked away from wealth and expectation, not out of anger, but out of a genuine desire to build a life rooted in authenticity rather than inheritance. Victoria Brown's story reveals a powerful truth about dynastic families, that even within vast empires built on imagination and optimism, descendants often seek their own forms of freedom. Freedom from myth, from expectation, and ultimately from the legacy that shaped their birthright. Number 2. Brad Lund Bradford. Disney Lund, born in 1956 to Sharon Mae Disney and her second husband William Lund, would become the most publicly scrutinized of all Walt Disney's grandchildren. Not because he sought attention, but because he became the center of one of the most contentious and heartbreaking inheritance battles in American family history. While the Disney name called forth images of enchantment and innocence for millions, Brad's life unfolded in a world marked not by fantasy, but by legal warfare, accusations, estrangement, and a struggle for autonomy that spanned decades. As a child, Brad grew up in a household where wealth and instability coexisted uneasily. Sharon, often battling illness and emotional turmoil, relied on her extended family for support, while her marriage to William Lund brought both affection and volatility into the home. Brad, from an early age, lived with the burden of being one of the primary heirs to the Disney fortune, a position that drew the interest of lawyers, trustees, and relatives long before he reached adulthood. Unlike Diane's children, raised far from corporate influence, Brad's future became entangled in legal structures almost from the moment he was born. Following Sharon's premature death in 1993, Brad's life entered its most tumultuous chapter. Questions regarding his inheritance, estimated in the hundreds of millions, ignited a prolonged series of court cases involving trustees, attorneys, and even members of his own family. At the heart of the conflict was a dispute over Brad's competence and independence. Trustees appointed to protect his estate argued that he lacked the capacity to manage his own affairs, while Brad insisted he was being manipulated, controlled, and financially starved by those entrusted with his welfare. The battle took on a tragically public dimension. Court documents surfaced, accusations flew between family members, and Brad found himself portrayed alternately as a vulnerable heir in need of protection, and as a fully capable adult stripped of his autonomy by powerful interests. The legal proceedings became a fierce struggle over identity and dignity, turning Brad into an unwilling symbol of the darker side of dynastic inheritance. Despite the turmoil, Brad's resilience remained evident. He fought for years to regain control of his life and finances, repeatedly challenging trustees he believed were working against his interests. His determination reflected not entitlement, but a deeply human desire to reclaim agency in a world where his family name had drawn vultures rather than support. While his case never fully escaped litigation, Brad continued to assert his independence, advocating for his rights with a quiet but persistent resolve. Away from the courtroom, Brad led a private, grounded life. He avoided public appearances and rarely gave interviews, preferring to live far from the spotlight that had consumed so much of his energy. Those close to him described him as kind, soft-spoken, and deeply wounded by the betrayals he endured. His story is not one of privilege squandered, but of a man caught in the machinery of wealth so vast that it overshadowed the human being at its center. Brad Lund's story stands in stark contrast to the carefully protected, tightly bonded world of Diane's children. It represents the vulnerability that can accompany inheritance, the way immense wealth can fracture families, distort relationships, and turn loved ones into adversaries. In a dynasty built on imagination and wonder, his life exposes the shadows that form when magic is replaced with mistrust. In the story of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, Brad Lund's chapter is the most haunting. A portrait of a man fighting not to escape the Disney name, but to reclaim his own identity beneath its enormous weight. Number 1. Michelle Lund. Michelle A. Lund, born in 1959 as the twin sister of Brad Lund, grew up sharing not only a home and a heritage with him, but also the complicated emotional terrain of being one of Walt Disney's heirs. Yet Michelle's journey diverged sharply from her brother's, revealing a path marked by ambition, artistry, estrangement, and a willingness to confront the responsibilities and contradictions of immense inherited wealth. If Brad became the symbol of a dynasty trapped in legal warfare, Michelle emerged as its most outspoken moral critic, a role that placed her at the center of a public reckoning with the Disney fortune. Raised in the same turbulent household as Brad and their older half-sister Victoria, Michelle experienced early instability shaped by their mother Sharon's illness and the shifting dynamics of the Disney Lund family. But while Brad internalized the family's volatility, Michelle pushed against it. She grew into a fiercely independent young woman, intellectually sharp and unafraid of confrontation. Her formative years were spent questioning the world around her, including the insulated privilege she was born into. This questioning would later define her adult life and public identity. As she matured, Michelle pursued a path that blended academic rigor with artistic curiosity. She explored writing, philosophy, and social issues with a depth that surprised those who assumed Walt Disney's grandchildren lived simple lives of comfort. Her interests extended beyond the cultural sphere her grandfather helped shape. Michelle sought to understand inequality, exploitation, and the ways in which inherited wealth can distort both personal identity and societal balance. Her growing awareness of these themes would eventually lead her into conflict not only with the trustees managing her inheritance, but with the very idea of dynastic wealth itself. While Brad battled trustees to claim independence, Michelle took a different route. She withdrew, reflected, and emerged as a vocal advocate for confronting privilege. Her critiques were not dramatic gestures of rebellion, but thoughtful, deeply personal examinations of what it meant to inherit a share of a multi-billion-dollar empire built on global entertainment. Her willingness to question the moral burden of inherited wealth set her apart from the rest of the family, echoing tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface of the Disneyland branch. Michelle also became known for her philanthropy, often directed toward causes that challenged structural inequities. She approached giving not as an obligation, but as a responsibility tied to her own ethics rather than to a family legacy. Her donations and advocacy reflected an understanding that wealth carries moral weight, a message that resonated sharply against the backdrop of her family's legal disputes. While Brad fought for the right to access his inheritance, Michelle questioned whether such inheritance should exist in its current form at all. Despite her intelligence and independence, Michelle's relationship with her family became increasingly strained over the years. The estate battles that engulfed her brother touched her life as well, creating fractures that never fully healed. She remained largely private, giving few interviews and maintaining a life defined by introspection rather than public identity. Yet those who encountered her work or her advocacy describe a woman who confronted discomfort with honesty. Someone who refused to hide behind the Disney name and instead interrogated its influence with rare transparency. Michelle Lunn's story completes the narrative of Walt Disney's grandchildren with a tone both challenging and revealing. She represents the introspective conscience of the dynasty, the grandchild who looked directly at the contradictions of inherited magic and questioned the systems that sustained it. In a family shaped by creativity, empire, and myth, Michelle's voice stands apart as a reminder that legacies are not merely inherited. They are examined, confronted, and ultimately reshaped by those courageous enough to look beneath their surface. Among Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren, one figure stands out not because of corporate power, creative achievement, or public acclaim, but because she reshaped the very meaning of inheritance, legacy, and responsibility within the Disney dynasty. That grandchild is Abigail Disney, the middle daughter of Sharon Mae Disney and William Lund, a woman whose life has become both a continuation of and a challenge to the empire her grandfather built. Abigail's influence began quietly, shaped by the same mix of privilege and instability that marked the Lund household. But as she matured, she developed a piercing awareness of the world around her, an awareness sharpened by the contradictions between her family's cultural legacy and the inequities she witnessed globally. Abigail did not inherit her grandfather's passion for animation or her uncle Ron Miller's drive for corporate leadership. Instead, she inherited something far more complex: the courage to question the moral foundations of the empire she was born into. She built her life around storytelling, but not the kind that involves castles, fairies, or animated heroes. Abigail became a documentary filmmaker, using her craft to expose inequality, injustice, and the hidden structures that support wealth and power. Her films dissect systemic failures with a clarity that cannot be dismissed, revealing a voice fiercely committed to truth. Through her work, She reclaimed storytelling as a tool for accountability, not entertainment. Yet, her most transformative impact would come through her outspoken criticism of the Disney company itself, particularly its executive compensation practices and the widening gap between corporate prosperity and worker well-being. Abigail publicly condemned the disparity between the wages of theme park employees and the millions earned by corporate executives. Her words carried weight not because of her surname alone, but because she spoke with moral conviction rooted in lived experience. She challenged shareholders, executives, and even the mythology of the Disney magic, arguing that true legacy requires responsibility, not just success. In taking on her own family's corporation, Abigail did something no other Disney grandchild had dared to do. She became a catalyst for conversation, forcing a global brand built on fantasy to confront its real-world consequences. Her advocacy positioned her not against the Disney legacy, but within it, extending Walt Disney's original values of optimism, fairness, and community into the modern era. But with a critical eye he never publicly displayed. Her influence radiated outward. Employees rallied behind her words. Journalists amplified her message. Academics cited her positions on wealth inequality. And audiences began to reconsider the true cost of entertainment empires. In a family where some descendants embraced privacy and others wrestled with personal struggles, Abigail stood as a rare figure of public conscience, the heir who refused to let silence become complicity. She is not the face of the Disney brand. She never sought that role. Instead, she became its mirror. And through that mirror, audiences could see the shadows behind the magic. Abigail Disney's significance lies in her ability to redefine what it means to inherit a legacy. She forced the world, and her own family, to confront uncomfortable truths. She expanded the Disney narrative beyond imagination and profit, adding chapters about justice, accountability, and humanity. In doing so, she became the most influential Disney grandchild, not for preserving her grandfather's legacy, but for challenging it in order to keep its deeper values alive. The story of Walt Disney's 10 grandchildren is not a fairy tale, nor is it a simple continuation of the magic their grandfather created. It is a sweeping, deeply human narrative shaped by privilege, fracture, resilience, and the ongoing struggle to define identity under the weight of a name known around the world. Their lives reveal how legacy does not move in a straight line from one generation to the next, but splinters into 10 distinct paths, each shaped by the same origin, yet transformed by the choices, challenges, and philosophies of those who inherited it. The 7 children of Diane Disney Miller formed a branch rooted in grounding and intention, raised in a home defined by love, discipline, and moral clarity. They represent the steady heart of the Disney dynasty. Christopher, Joanne, Tamara, Jennifer, Walter, Ronald Jr., and Patrick each carried the family's values differently. Through quiet craftsmanship, artistic devotion, spiritual searching, compassionate service, emotional struggle, or unshakable integrity. Their paths reveal a legacy lived not through spectacle, but through character. They are the heirs Walt hoped for. Independent, grounded, and guided by the belief that imagination must always be tethered to humanity. The branch of Sharon Mae Disney stood in stark contrast, shaped by turbulence, health struggles, early loss, and the complexities of extraordinary wealth. Victoria, Brad, and Michelle inherited a world where protection was inconsistent, where fortune arrived without the emotional infrastructure to support it, and where the family name became both a gift and a burden. Their stories lay bare the fragile reality behind financial empires, that money can magnify wounds rather than heal them. Victoria sought meaning far from the corporate world. Brad fought for autonomy against forces he believed controlled him. Michelle confronted the moral cost of inherited privilege, becoming the most outspoken conscience of the entire dynasty. Together, the 10 grandchildren reflect the vast emotional landscape of the Disney legacy, a portrait of a family that has lived in the shadow of a man whose imagination reshaped global culture. yet whose private life was marked by humility and restraint. Walt Disney worked tirelessly to build worlds where dreams felt safe and simple. But the generations that followed reveal how complex life becomes when fantasy collides with reality, when inheritance intersects with identity, and when the name on the castle gate becomes the same name on your birth certificate. Their stories show that the true legacy of Walt Disney is not found only in the films, the parks, or the characters cherished by billions. It is found in the lives of his descendants who carried his values, questioned his empire, endured personal battles, or forged new definitions of what it means to inherit magic in a world that rarely offers the simplicity of happily ever after. The grandchildren of Walt Disney remind us that even the most iconic legacies are ultimately human ones. Fragile, complicated, and shaped by the choices of those born into them. And in their journeys, we find a final truth. Magic may be inherited, but what one does with it is entirely personal.